Now, I usually start off talks asking who likes reading. But as you're all keen readers of the magazine, I don't really need to ask that. But I wonder, who likes writing? Hands up, those of you that like writing. Nearly everybody. Well, I loved writing too. And sadly, there weren't any special magazines where you could send in stories when I was a little girl. So I'm very pleased that the magazine often does have brilliant short story competitions. But without going in for competitions, I still wrote and wrote and wrote. And I don't think I've got any of those really first stories, which is perhaps just as well, because probably they'd be a bit embarrassing now, because, you know, I wasn't a child phenomenon. I didn't sort of learn to read and write at the age of 3 or something like that. I learnt just the way you did. But by the time I was in year 5, okay, hands up those of you who are in year 5. Okay, by the time I was your age, I was quite serious about writing. I knew I didn't just like writing and want to write stories. I did harbour an ambition that I actually wanted to be a writer and have books published one day. And I very much enjoyed my time in year 5 because we had a really fantastic teacher. Didn't always like some of my teachers. Sorry if there are any teacher parents here. But in my year 5, we had a wonderful teacher called Mr. Townsend. And he was very kind, because in those long ago days, teachers weren't always kind. And if you were naughty, you got sort of hit on the back of your hands with a ruler, or they sometimes would throw chalk at you, which can be quite hard if it catches you on the temple like that. And the boys came off worse, because if they were cheeky, they actually still, in those long ago days, get the cane, which was pretty scary. But Mr. Townsend never dreamt of shouting or hitting any of us. He was just determined to make all of us happy at school, and he tried his best to find something great about each and every child. Now, perhaps he had a bit of a task with me, because I wasn't the most attractive-looking little girl. My mum wanted me to look like a long-ago child film star called Shirley Temple. And Shirley Temple had sort of enormous yellow ringlets and was very bright and bouncy and did tap dancing. And her mother apparently always used to say before she went on stage or starred in a movie, "Twinkle, Shirley, twinkle." Well, I didn't twinkle. I was the sort of child that liked to sit in the corner, suck my thumb and read my book. And so my mother, rather hoping that I might be encouraged to behave like Shirley Temple, gave me a home perm. And it was a total disaster. It sort of stuck up in a mad sort of frizz all over the place, but it just looked so absolutely wrong on me and made all my friends sort of tease me a bit. Also, it had suddenly been discovered that the reason I didn't always see what was on the blackboard or I bumped into things because I was incredibly short-sighted. And so I'd been given glasses, so I didn't feel at my best. Also, I wasn't very good at all my lessons, fine in English and history and things like that. I was absolutely useless at any kind of maths, which my father was really upset about because he had a job in an office which was all to do with keeping accounts. And he couldn't believe that he had such a stupid little girl who really struggled. And so whenever we had maths homework, he would stand over me. Can you imagine anything more off-putting? And he would say, "No, you're making a mistake. Or what's the matter with you? Why aren't you getting on with it? I showed you how to do it." And then he'd sigh and say, "Well, I'm just going to have to show you again." And I'd say, "Promise you won't get cross with me?" And he'd say, "Promise you won't cry?" And then 5 minutes later, he'd be shouting, I'd be crying. So I never, ever learnt to do maths properly. And I also wasn't very great at anything to do with sports or PE. I was quite popular. I did have friends in the class. But even if one of my best friends was a team leader, choosing people to be, say, in the rounders team, she would never pick me because I couldn't catch a ball, I couldn't throw a ball, I couldn't run fast, completely useless. So imagine poor Mr. Townsend thinking, my goodness me, what are we going to say that will make this child have some confidence and enjoy herself? But he had read some of my English compositions, that's what we called them then, maybe call them essays, whatever. And he thought, I quite like the way she writes. And he said something along these lines. And because I trusted him utterly, I said, well, I do want to be a writer. And so he said, well, okay, if you want to be a writer, why don't you practice now? And he actually gave me a notebook and said, you can write me a story in this. And I called it my first novel. Now, it wasn't anywhere near as long as a real book. It was only about 10, 15 pages long at most. But I still have it. It's about the only thing that I've actually managed to keep from my childhood. I would have brought it here today, but it is literally falling to bits. But it was a story about a big family. It had the rather odd title, Meet the Maggots. Not a glamorous surname for my family, but even then I wasn't interested in writing glamour stories, romantic stories, happy ever after stories. I wanted gritty stories. So I had this poor family with a mother who had to go out to work to help Dad look after all the children and find the rent for them and the food for them. And on the cover of the book, I drew the family, and Mum had lines all the way across her face because she was so worried about them all. And then the children, I love making up stories about big families because I was a very small family. There was just my mum, my dad, and me. And when you think about all these little children in the family that I'm going to tell you about, see if you can think if they remind you of anybody that you might have read about in one of my books. Now, there was, the eldest sister was very girly and loved to go out with her friends. She had lovely blonde hair. She was a bit like several of my girls, a bit like, anybody read The Worst Thing About My Sister? The older girl in that, or I did quite a while ago write teenage stories, and there was a girl called Magda in one of these who was a bit like that. So, okay, that was the eldest sister. And then there was a sister who was a bookworm, and she had glasses, and she could get really quite anxious at times. And that's like probably a lot of my characters, and certainly a bit like me when I was little. There were identical twins. Now, who can tell me a book about identical twins? Yes? Double Act. Well done, well done. And the twins in my book that I wrote as a child, they were forever playing tricks on other people and had their own language. And then there was a rather quiet, shy boy who got a bit teased and couldn't always stand up for himself. Now, this is a hard one. Can anybody think of a boy in one of my books? Tim, you are so clever. You could all go on mastermind for Jacqueline Wilson books. But then the youngest child, I suppose she was about 5 or 6, was incredibly bossy and forever was raising her voice to make herself heard above all her brother and sisters. And she had mad curly hair. Now, does that remind you of anybody? Yes. It's very similar to her, but there's also a girl. I can see her face on some of these beaker bags at the front. Yes? Tracy Beaker, absolutely. And, you know, it's really weird to think that the beginnings of all these characters were still in my head then, and I've kept hold of them without really thinking about it all this time until I could write really long books about them. Now, as the introduction told you, I got really lucky because I was desperate to be a writer, but my mum and dad and all the rest of the teachers, apart from lovely Mr. Townsend, didn't really have much faith in me being a writer. I didn't come from the sort of home where everybody went to university. People mostly left school as soon as possible, and they went to work in the local shops or the local factories. And it just seemed a daft idea to my parents that I would want to be a writer. And they said, look, you know, it's nice to have your dreams, but don't be silly. You need to have a proper job. And so when I left school, my mum said I had to go and learn to be a typist. Because in those long ago days before computers, if you were a boss in an office, you didn't want to bother using a typewriter yourself to write a letter, because it was harder work than writing on a computer. So you got a secretary or a typist to do it for you. And in my day, if people didn't quite know what to do with a girl for work, they generally said, well, train her to be a secretary. So I went to the local technical college and did my training, and I didn't really enjoy it very much, but I still somehow nursed this feeling right inside me that I hoped one day I really could be a proper writer and get something published. And I was still writing away then. It didn't deter me that it didn't seem likely that I would never get the book published. And then I was so lucky when I was looking at the end of my course for a secretarial job in the local newspaper, I saw this advert, wanted teenage writers, and I wrote up for more information, and they said they wanted some short stories, and I thought, well, why don't I give it a go? My mum and dad had very kindly, for a sort of combined birthday and Christmas present, just bought me my very own small typewriter. And so, probably not typing very well, in spite of my training, I typed out a story, sent it off to this wonderful publishing company, the very same one that publishes the Jacqueline Wilson mag, and to my complete astonishment, they decided that they wanted to publish it. I think it had made them laugh, because it was all about being a teenager and going to your first posh dance and getting really worried about it, but excited too. And you and your friends will spend ages on your hair and your makeup and wearing your first high heels and everything. And in those days, most dances had live bands. And then when you go into the hall, all the girls are looking at the boys and all the boys are looking at the girls. And then in those days, you had to wait until a boy came to ask you to dance, which seems a bit weird now, but girls didn't generally dance together, and certainly girls didn't go and ask a boy for a dance. So you just had to stand there. Imagine how awkward that was. And in my story, there's a girl standing there, and her best friend gets asked up for a dance, and her second best friend does, and then suddenly there she is all on her own. And, you know, she feels so self-conscious that everybody's looking at her thinking, who's that poor girl who doesn't have anyone to dance with? And so my girl is, decided to do all sorts of things pretending she was having a good time. And I do remember one of the things she thought of. She went and stood right by the band and peered at the drummer, who was the most good-looking, as if he were her boyfriend, and would sort of smile at him and go like that. And I'm sure he got really unnerved if this had been true. But, you know, a lot of other people thought, that's the drummer's girlfriend. Oh, she just goes around with the band all the time. And I think this made somebody in the office chuckle. And so they decided, although my story wasn't quite the sort of thing they were looking for, they thought, okay, we'll buy it. And up till that stage, I hadn't ever really thought that if you wrote anything, you got some money. Now, it really wasn't a lot of money. It was just over £3. And even in those days, that wasn't a lot of money. But I was thrilled because it meant that somebody had faith in me and thought I could be a real published writer. So I wrote lots more, and within months, the company had offered me a job up in Dundee. And this is a bit scary because I was only 17 and I'd never really been to Scotland before. But I thought at least there was one thing I did that was sensible in my teens, because I was rather a silly girl too, was that you might only get one big opportunity like that. And I thought, I want to write, it will be great training, so I'll go for it. So off I went. I lived in a girls' hostel for a while at my mum's insistence, because she thought correctly that there would be a fierce matron who would keep an eye on me. And then I palled up with another girl, and we had a flat together, and I just had a whale of a time in Scotland, and I learnt how to write all sorts of different things about writing. But the best thing of all was that I learnt how to keep on writing even if I didn't feel like it, or if I couldn't really think of a thing to say. Because if you're a journalist, you can't have so-called writer's block. You know you've got to get your story in by a certain time, or there will be blank pages in the magazine. So you just force it out of yourself. And so now, all these many years later, I've never, I'm crossing my fingers, had writer's block. I just, every morning, start writing, and in about an hour's time, I have got most of what I want to say down on the page. Long may it continue, please. So I wrote for the magazine, and that was lovely. And then I got married and had my daughter and went back down south. But I was writing all the time, and I wrote lots of stories still for magazines to earn some money. And I very much wanted to get a proper novel published. And at long last, although I was only looking back quite young, about 22, 23, I did get a book published, and then another and another. But actually, none of them were a huge success. People think that all you need to do is write a story and it gets published and you become rich and famous. Well, that might happen to very, very few people, but it certainly didn't happen to me. I wrote at least 2 books a year, occasionally 3, and for many years, about 20 years, nothing much really happened, and I had to keep on writing lots of extra magazines and articles to pay the bills. But then at long last, my sort of breakthrough book got written, and that was The Story of Tracy Beaker, which was, I think I wrote it 28 years ago, long ago. But I remember vividly how I got the idea and all about it, in that I had seen some photographs of real children in the local paper, and they were living in a children's home, and they were all desperate to be fostered, to have kind families looking after them until either they could go back to their own families, or they would look after them until they were old enough to leave home anyway. And I looked at all these photos, and some of the children were smiling slightly desperately, as if saying, you know, please, will you foster me? And some children were looking a bit, I don't care if I'm fostered or not. And they inside, they wanted to be, but just didn't want it to show too much. And I thought, goodness, what must it feel like to be one of these children? I mean, there were some very little children, toddlers, and I thought, well, they couldn't know anything about it, so that was fine. And their chances of being fostered were quite big, because everybody loves little babies, little cuddly toddlers. It's harder when you get older, because, you know, people think, you know, might they have behaviour problems? You know, not quite sure whether they'd fit into our family. So I looked at these kids and I thought, oh gosh, I would like to write their story about what it feels like to be kind of advertised like this. And luckily, I have a friend who's worked for the fostering network for many years and very successfully fostered children herself. And so she told me all about the process. And she also gave me a book that fostered children were given in those days called My Book About Me. And the child would be sat down with their care worker and then they'd have to fill in everything. Ordinary things like your name and when your birthday is, and sort of more interesting things like what you would do if you had 3 wishes or what sort of pet you'd like, all this kind. So I thought, this is the way I'm going to start my book. So it's kind of easy to read right from the beginning. And I imagined somebody sitting down with this rather difficult child who wants to mess around and do things her way. And I thought, yes, that's the way to get the story started. And I knew right from the start that it was going to be about a girl, and I knew her first name, Tracy, because it was a modern, bouncy sort of name, and it just appealed to me. But I couldn't think of her last name, her surname. I had it into my head that I might call her after one of my daughter's friends at school, who had the most unbelievable name of Tracy Jelly. And I thought it was a marvellous name, but it sounded almost too made up, even though she was a real girl. It sounded also as if she might be a cartoon character. And I also didn't want to write about anybody called Tracy Jelly, because I wanted my fictional girl to be a bit fierce and a bit naughty. And I was sure that Tracy Jelly was a very sweet, kind, well-behaved girl, and she might be quite upset about me borrowing her name. So I thought, okay, stick with Tracy, but we'll find another surname. And I thought about this one morning in my bath. Now, how many of you, if you don't live in too big a family, like to lie back in the bath and daydream? Any of you? It's a good place. You're warm, you can play around with the soap, you can just, I don't know, it's that slight mistiness that you get in bathrooms with the door closed that makes it a sort of dreamy place to get ideas. And so one morning I was lying back in the soap suds, enjoying myself, but also it was on my mind, I have to get Tracy's surname. And so I looked all around the bathroom for inspiration. Now, you can get good ideas for stories, but somehow bathrooms don't lend themselves to being good for surnames. So I thought, shall I call my girl Tracy Flannel? No. Tracy Soapsuds? No. Tracy Toothbrush? No. Tracy Toilet? No. And so I gave up thinking about finding a name for Tracy. I got on with washing my hair, and in those long ago days didn't have much money at all, certainly didn't have any fancy shower or shower attachments. When I washed my hair, what I did when I wanted to sluice it clean again, I kept an old plastic beaker on the end of the bath, and I would pick it up and just clean my hair like that. And I looked at this beaker, and I suddenly thought, in a kind of frivolous way, shall I call her Tracy Beaker? And somehow there was a quirkiness. It didn't sound quite as odd as Tracy Jelly, but I thought, yeah, I like that idea. So I went with that. I'm going to slide along the sofa for a drink of water. There, that's better. And, yeah, I'll sit in the middle now. And so I decided that what this book really needed was lots of illustrations, as if Tracy herself was drawing all over the place. And so my then editor who was a very interesting man called David Fickling, said, no problem, Jackie, you can have lots and lots of illustrations if that's what you'd like. And he said, actually, I think I know the very person for you. And he showed me a book of illustrated poems, and there were all these lovely, quirky drawings. And I thought, yeah, they're exactly the sort of thing. Now, quite unusually, because often authors never get to meet their illustrators, David Fickling said, I'll introduce the two of you together. So we both went to the publisher's office, and David said to me, right, Jackie, I'd like you to meet Nick Sharratt. And I just liked Nick straight away, and I hoped he liked me. And I told him how much I liked his drawings. But inside my head, I had just one reservation, because Nick was quite quiet at that stage. And he also, most unusually for Nick, if you've ever seen him nowadays, he was wearing some really quite conventional grey suit. And I thought, well, I love the way he illustrates, but will he be able to do really daft, mad, funny illustrations? And then I think my nose was running, and so I bent down, fishing my handbag for a tissue, and saw that there was a gap between Nick's trousers and his shoe. Now, I've got quite restrained socks on today. Mine are sort of blue and black to coordinate my outfit. Nick's were bright mustard yellow with orange dots. And I thought, yes, he is the one for me. And it was the socks that did it. And in actual fact, for years afterwards, because Nick and I are great friends now, I mean, I would give him a proper Christmas present, but I would always try and find an outrageous pair of socks too, just to remind him of how we met. So basically, I think the story of Tracy Beaker really became the story of Jackie and Nick, because we've been in a lovely artistic partnership ever since. And for a while, Nick did live up in Edinburgh, so we didn't see each other very often. I lived near London, but now Nick's back on the south coast of England in Brighton, and I have moved quite near the sea, only about 10 miles from Brighton, so we get to see each other much more often, which is great fun. And so the story of Tracy Beaker came out, and it had some nice reviews in the papers, and I was pleased that it sold reasonably well, but I'm not sure it would have become as big and successful as it has been if it hadn't been for the television series. Now, does anybody know the name of the girl who plays Tracy Beaker on the television? Yes? Danny Harmer, indeed. And Danny was a big success playing Tracy, and the television series seemed to go on forever. And as Danny got bigger, we had sort of Tracy Beaker Returns when she was too old to play a little girl, and in actual fact, we had Tracy as a kind of temporary care worker in a children's home. And so that really sort of helped make Tracy a popular figure that lots and lots and lots of people knew about, not just people who like to read books. I, meanwhile, had written more Tracy books. I'd written a book called I Dare You, Tracy Beaker, where Tracy is being fostered by lovely, patient, kind Cam. And my goodness, she has to be patient sometimes, because Tracy can be very difficult still. And also, Tracy has always loved playing dare games. I think a lot of people's favourite passages in the first Tracy Beaker story is when Tracy and her arch enemy Justine dare each other to do things. And when I used to go to schools, if they were a bit rowdy, I would always, do this act of, asking them to to tell me their worst ever dares, which was great fun. And then I'd act out being Justine and Tracy and their dares. I'm not sure this always went down well with any adults in the room, but it got the children laughing and calmed them down a bit afterwards. So there was that book. There was then... there was a book called Starring Tracy Beaker. I'm being prompted here. This is wonderful. You can come home with me and remind me about all the books that I've written. And then Tracy is at school. I think she's in year 6, and they have to do a Christmas play, and the teacher has chosen A Christmas Carol, and Tracy is actually Scrooge, the mean old grumpy man that doesn't believe in Christmas. And things go slightly wrong, but she is a big success at the end. I did write a tiny weeny book for charity called Tracy Beaker's Thumping Heart. But then I thought, right, that's it. You know, Tracy, you've had your day. And so for many, many years, I didn't write about Tracy. I wrote all sorts of different books. I started to write historical books, like the Hetty Feather books. But for ages, when I gave talks like this, I might give Tracy a mention, because she's always been very popular. And I joke that maybe in my old age, I keep myself going by writing more books about Tracy. I would joke that we might have Tracy Beaker Gets Married, Tracy Beaker as a mum, Tracy Beaker's Midlife Crisis, Tracy Beaker OAP. But then last year, I suddenly thought, why don't I actually do it? Why don't I write about Tracy as a mum? Now, I've been on television quite a lot recently and on the radio because my mum, Tracy Beaker, has come out, and which is indeed the story of Tracy, who's now about in her mid-30s, and she has a 10-year-old daughter, Jess, and it's Jess who's telling the story. And as you can imagine, it's kind of a fun thing to have Tracy Beaker as a mum, but she frequently makes Jess cringe with embarrassment, because Tracy still can be quite feisty. But I was on one of the breakfast morning television things, and they'd already, the day before, been to a school, and they'd asked all the children, what sort of mother do you think Tracy Beaker would be? And to my astonishment, they all said, oh, she'd be a rubbish mum. Oh, imagine Tracy. No, she'd be dreadful. And I was really quite upset, because I think, and I've always known, that Tracy Beaker would be a good mum. Because I don't believe that it doesn't, if you've had some really quite difficult, neglectful parenting, and you haven't ever experienced having a loving, kind mum there for you all the time, that doesn't mean you can't be a wonderful mum yourself. And also for Tracy, since she was 11, she's had Cam, her foster mum, showing her how when you have a mum like that, it doesn't matter what you do, they still love you. They might get cross with you or irritated with you, but they're there for you. And Tracy wants to be that sort of mum. And so I have her in my new book, being, I think, a marvellous mum. But she hasn't really changed character. She still has what nowadays I think people would say are anger issues. And if anybody picks on Jess at school, my goodness, Tracy's there, you know, telling the children to lay off her, and even committing the dreadful sin of going into the school and having it out with the teacher. You know, weren't you looking after my daughter better? You know, you can just imagine Jess, oh, no, stop it. And so she is a very caring mum, but there's a wonderful relationship between Tracy and Jess. Now, those of you who've read quite a few of my books will know that my books aren't always sweetness and light. Difficult things happen. Sometimes funny things, sometimes sad things. And so there, I start the book off, Tracy and Jess, they live in not a very nice block of flats, but they've made it their own little palace inside with all sorts of different things they've bought from boot fairs, and it's cosy. Though Tracy always wishes she could find a wonderful, wonderful big house, you know, because she's got some amazing job, but she doesn't want to do any work that stops her being able to look after Jess herself most of the time. But then Tracy meets up with somebody from the past. In I Dare You, Tracy Beaker, she's just been fostered, and she hangs out at this sort of old house with two boys. And one of the boys is nicknamed Football because he's very good at football, but he is a sort of rather sad kid. He's a rather angry kid. He and Tracy are kind of enemies, but then they become friends and they mess around together, play football together, although to Tracy's irritation, Football is much better at it than her. Well, now Tracy's in her 30s and so is Football, and we find out his name is actually Sean Godfrey, and he was a professional footballer, I think Premier League, but now he's a bit past it. He's opened up his own gym, sports centre, this sort of thing, and Tracy has gone there to learn kickboxing, which I thought would rather appeal to her, and she meets up with Sean, and suddenly it looks like love is on the scene. And Jess is a bit worried because she enjoys it being just Tracy and her at home. But Tracy she's had boyfriends in the past, and obviously she had a relationship with Jess's father, though it didn't work out, sadly. But Jess says, well, you know, Mum is a bit fickle. Her boyfriends usually last 3 months or so, and then, you know, she gets fed up with them. So I'm not going to worry about this Sean Godfrey, and Jess doesn't really like him very much because he's not a bad man, but he's a bit of a show-off. And he's become much better looking as he's grown up, and he's had to be fit, obviously, for his footballing career. But he's one of these guys that still, you know, he wears expensive, but suits that look much too small for him. And when he walks, he sort of struts like this. And he's got a kind of modern but slightly daft haircut. And it's just everything that puts Jess's, you know, sort of teeth on edge. She doesn't like him, though he tries hard with her. But Tracy's fallen for him. And not only that, she's fallen for his lifestyle because he's rich. And he's got this huge, great house with its own swimming pool. And Tracy thinks this is everything I've ever wanted for my daughter. And so they go and live there, and Jess is not at all happy, but Cam, who's still very much on the scene, she's still Tracy's mum, she's Jess's granny, even though she's not a blood relation. And Cam knows that Jess has always been mad on dogs and desperately wants a dog. So she takes her to Battersea Dogs and Cats Home, which is where I've got all my pets from. And Jess has a dog that bears a very strong resemblance to my own dog. And the characteristics that they share is that Jess can't train her dog. I couldn't train my dog. They train us to do whatever they want. I went to puppy training classes. I did try very hard indeed. And it was quite humiliating because there was a small girl about that big who got her little puppy trained almost instantly. And I trained with my Jackson, and I kept talking to him and saying, come on, pal, we have to do this. But now, if he runs away anywhere and you call Jackson, Jackson, and then you call Jackson, and he just never, ever bothers to do what he's told until he's ready for it. But luckily for me, my Jackson loves children, because it would look dreadful for me if I had a dog that just growled at any passing child. And he's He's particularly good if anybody's ill or elderly. He's a very, very sweet-natured dog. He just does things his own way, and yeah, I'm very fond of him. I'm away for a few days, but I know my friend is looking after him well. So I adored writing about this dog in My Mum Tracy Beaker, and I rather think there are going to be an awful lot of dogs in the future in my books. But anyway, this comforts Jess, but things still aren't quite right for her, although Tracy seems happy enough. And then, I had such fun in this book, I kept introducing other characters from the past, and I introduced Tracy's worst enemy as a child. Now, who can tell me what her name is? Yes? Justine Littlewood. And my goodness me, it was fun seeing what Justine Littlewood was like grown up. And things start to go a bit wrong then. I won't tell you all about it in case you want to get the book, and I don't want to spoil it for you, but different things happen. But at the end of this book, Jess and Tracy are going to be starting a whole new life, and there is a big surprise. And I'm pleased with the way the book ends, but I actually feel it's actually not the end of their story together. And so I've written another book, meanwhile, that will come out about April next year. But this time next year, in October or maybe just beginning of November, there might well be a brand new Tracy and Jess book, because I think I've not finished with the Beaker girls, and so maybe, you never know, there might be more Beaker bags given away from the magazine and more lovely features about Jess and Beaker. Now, you've all sat down